introduce our next panel and Professor Annabelle Gower, the chair of the panel. So Professor Gower is chaired professor in digital economy and the director of the Center of Digital Economy at the University of Surrey. She is a world-class academic pioneer in digital platforms and platform-based innovation ecosystems. She was appointed as an independent digital expert for the UK Competition and Markets Authority in 2023. She has advised the European Commission on the regulation of online platforms. She has also advised the UK House of Lords, the UK government, and the OECD. Annabelle co-authored 2 excellent books on platforms, The Business of Platforms and Platform Leadership. Annabelle, over to you. I'll let you introduce Rory, Alexander, and Daniel.
Delighted to be sharing this panel where we have fantastic guests today. Thank you very much, platform leaders and Benoit, as well as Laure-Claire Rayet for organizing this session. We are going to have a fantastic conversation about the question of regulating, but for what? Regulating for growth. So let me introduce my my esteemed panelists. So we're gonna have Daniel Gordon, who is a partner at the Greenlight, and who has amazing experience both at the CMA for a number of years, as well as the Treasury. We have Alexander Baker, who is the CEO of Fingleton, who is the Strategic Regulatory Advisory, and who was also working previously at the OFT and has a lot of experience in these regulatory questions. And we have also Rory O'Donoghue, who is leading global innovation policy and government in the government affair part of Google. So I wanted to just have a very brief introduction to situate our panel. We know that there have been developments in the past few years, and very recently at an increasing pace, of regulatory activity in the domain of digital platforms. Obviously, with the European Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act that have attempted to solve the problem that was perceived that despite antitrust actions that lasted a long time against Google and others, there had been a feeling among regulatory circles and some part of civil society that the existing regulatory cadre and framework were not addressing some of the abuse of power problem, and in particular competition policy. So the DMA in particular is an attempt to complement existing rules which were mostly done ex post with an ex ante framework, creating a new status of gatekeepers, which is a small subset of the largest digital platforms, and imposing on them a list of do's and don'ts of activities that they should do or that should refrain to do. We've also seen in the UK, so closer to us, with the DMCCA Act, an approach that is trying to that is giving new powers to the CMA, and that is going to develop code of conduct for, again, a small subset of digital platform firms. They are not called in the UK gatekeepers. They're called firms with strategic market status. Again, with the idea that it would be important to regulate digital platforms. We also see on the other side of the Atlantic a number of activities from the Department of Justice with actions against some of the largest digital platforms. So in this setting where we see regulatory activity or judicial activity directed at trying to curtail the power of big tech platforms, we also see this message, especially given by the UK, that this regulation is not meant to curtail the success of companies, but it's really rather meant to enable conditions for growth. So we see these words of we regulate for innovation, we regulate for growth, And this panel is really going to try to tease out what could this mean, in particular in the UK context, but also in these other contexts. So this question of regulating for growth, what does it mean? What are the trade-offs? What does it mean concretely? And I would like to start by asking Daniel Gordon here. Daniel, if you could tell us, based in particular in your experience at the CMA, and also given your knowledge of the Treasury, what does growth mean in this context? Is it growth in terms of more users are going to grow? Is it more growth on the demand side? Is it growth on the supply side? Is it growth for existing incumbent firms? Is it growth with new entrants and SMEs? And what is the role of innovation in its context? So what are the main growth levers? And if you can see, are there some trade-offs there in this agenda for growth? Very, very eager to hear your views on this, Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Annabelle, and thanks really for the kind introduction. I was at the Treasury many years ago, right? And I did run it was a small analytic team looking at the economic foundations of growth. And this was back, it's so long ago, back under the Blair Brown days, where they're very keen on driving evidence-based policy. What I thought would be useful and be really interesting to contrast the view and the relationship between competition and regulatory policy as was conceived then, and then look at how it looks now, because there's been a radical change in perception. If you roll back the clock to that time, we were very focused on trend growth. You asked what we mean by growth. The best thing to think about is productivity, is a measure output worker, output per head, output per hour, those sorts of things to be looking at. And there was an increasing evidence that competition was a good driver of growth, based on international experience, based on firm level evidence, based on growth accounting approaches, those sorts of things. And that this was something also that contrasted, that explained what was a gap in productivity performance between the UK and comparative countries at the time. Now that was, and it was a competition, it was never seen as sort of a key driver of growth, but it was one of the drivers of growth, and there were 5 in total. But that was an innovation to bring competition into growth, and it changed this concept, the context and the positioning of competition policy. It moved it from a sort of technocratic, reactive agency approach to wanting to be proactive, to seeing it as a part of economic policy, as a part of structural policy. And the legislation that it gave rise to, the white paper actually drew out on that evidence base leading to that, and it gave rise to the 2002 Enterprise Act, which drew on that and said we need a proactive agency, we need a robust agency, and enhanced its powers in a number of ways. Merger powers, criminalization of cartels, stronger markets powers, the area I looked after for many years, were all enhanced because it was seen as necessary to drive growth. Now that's back in 2002, right? Now, if you roll the clock forward, that perception from government and also officials has changed, it seems, right? And it started under the previous government. There was the Microsoft Activision merger was a particular flashpoint, and Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, said that the CMA must understand its wider responsibilities to promote growth. There was a very clear sort of indication that he was a bit worried that it was out of kilter with that. But it wasn't just the last government, right? It's the current government. As we've seen, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, made similar sorts of comments about it's important to make sure that every regulator in the country, especially our economic and competition regulators, he said, take growth seriously. And of course, those who are familiar with the UK landscape will be aware that the chair of the CMA, Marcus Bockerink, was dismissed in January. Again, because there was a lack of satisfaction about the CMA's focus on growth. And so the question is, what explains that difference? And when I'm talking about the UK context, I'm hoping a lot that I say chimes with context in other countries as well, particularly actually in the EU. because you could say, look, that is just a response of the government to big business. That's they've just been lobbied. It's just and big business would do that, and they don't like what the CMA is doing, and nor you would say, well, they shouldn't always like what the CMA is doing, so they're using channels in government. I think, you can't dismiss that entirely, but I think that to accept that explanation is only to accept part of the story. And I think it's particularly important to recognize that the sorts of areas where these tensions tend to arise is in dynamic innovation, digital markets. And I don't think that's surprising. And I think the simple truth is that competition policy has built up a lot of tools and is very good at looking at traditional markets. It tends to look at the measures it looks at: concentration, market power itself, profitability, excess price, all those sorts of things are very good in assessing competition in markets where innovation takes place, but not in the same way as these big dynamic innovative markets where there's often a winner takes all dynamic. And the competition takes place through innovation rather than through those traditional variables. But we haven't got those tools. They really just haven't been developed in the same way to understand the drivers of innovation in the same way that they have for the traditional markets, for bricks and mortar, static competition markets. Because even the term monopoly, I think, is sometimes challenging one to pull across, because when we get concerned about monopolies, we get concerned, yes, about excessive prices and those sorts of things. But when it comes to growth, what we're most worried about is a lazy fat cat not innovating, being inefficient because it doesn't have the competitive disciplines. And that can chime with a lot of sort of more traditional markets. But if you look at the big platforms, for example, it's any fair assessment would say, look, they do innovate quite a lot, right? They spend a very high proportion of their revenues compared to other companies on R&D, and that not just on input measures, on output measures as well. So we need a sort of more nuanced approach. And what I was to say, I'm not saying that we need to just let rip and not have any regulated framework. I was involved at the CMA in the background work to the setting up the DMU, and there are still good arguments for, and there are good arguments for having an ex-ante regime. But we need the right tools, and we need the tools to develop so that as they capture the nuance of that, it doesn't just fall back on big is bad when it comes to innovation, and doesn't just say entry is good. You need also to make sure that you're safeguarding existing incentives. So that as I say, that there will be room for encouraging entry, but doing it in the right ways. But I think before we do that, we all in the competition community internationally need to look quite long and hard at whether we've got the right tools to do that. And this is particularly important to growth at the moment, because just to go back to the initial theme, because one of the startling facts that people look at in recent growth performance is they compare US performance with that in the UK and that in the EU. Whereas since the financial crisis, 2008, there's been quite impressive growth in the US. But in the EU, we haven't seen that. And in the UK, we haven't seen that. We've seen a fairly sclerotic performance. And this, of course, was the centerpiece of Draghi report. And Draghi, along with many others, pointed to the lack of scale and the need to encourage innovation in order to do that. And when you look into the drivers of growth in those areas, you do see that the big companies, as well as small companies, have driven innovation and and that innovation has had spillover effects that have had positive impacts on growth. So my headline message at the end is, if we're going to focus more on growth in these tech markets, it's really important that we take a nuanced and intelligent approach to that, and understands the incentives both on small players, the incentives and abilities both on small players and on large players, to do that and to deliver those wider spillover effects that are good for the economy and long-term trend growth.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for explaining so well that the tools that we had up until now might not be appropriate to really understand the nuanced and dynamic behavior of these digital markets. And thank you for clarifying these points. I would like to turn to Alexander now. Alex, can you help us decrypt what the government means when they want to steer regulators towards a pro-growth agenda? What scenarios do you think they have in mind in the UK? And perhaps you can compare and contrast that with what you understand the EU and the US approaches are.
Sure, I will do. But first, thank you for inviting me on to this panel. It's great to join you this afternoon. And so the focus on growth in the UK has largely come about because of the perception of the UK as a destination for foreign direct investment and as a place to do business. And if you speak to those who are close to the current Prime Minister or the Chancellor, one of the things they will tell you is very early on in their time in the new government last year, they were hearing a lot of complaints about how easy it was for businesses to transact in the UK. And there were a lot of complaints in particular about the Competition and Markets Authority. And typically, these complaints came from organisations headquartered outside of the UK and operating globally. So I think that had an impact on the agenda for the government. They've come out and said growth is their number one priority. And if you think about the last few years, the impact of Brexit has been really important in all of that for two reasons. The first, I think the UK needs to think about how attractive it is as a destination for foreign direct investment, but also the Competition and Markets Authority got some additional tools, or at least its scope to apply tools increased because we detached ourselves from the EU treaties. But let's be clear, the focus on growth and being an attractive destination for foreign direct investment are slightly different things. And it's just curious that this came about because of the perception of foreign companies and their ability to do business in the UK. What the government is asking of the CMA is no different to what previous governments have asked of other sector regulators in the UK, the sector regulator for water, Ofwat, the sector regulator for gas and electricity, Ofgem, and the communications regulator, Ofcom. They have a statutory duty to promote economic growth. The CMA didn't, but now it's had a very strong steer from the government that it should take into account its impact on growth and how it works. And that's largely come about through the strategic steer. I think there was a link put in the chat for those joining the webinar this afternoon. That strategic steer is a lot shorter than ones I've seen in the past and very focused on growth. And for businesses interacting with the CMA, they're likely to see that play out primarily through process, but also then, I think, in time, substantive outcomes. And the CMA, in articulating how it will respond to the government's call for a focus on economic growth, has outlined this 4P framework, which you'll hear Sarah Cardell, the CEO of the CMA, talk a lot about. And the 4Ps are pace, predictability, proportionality, and process. So doing things quickly, being consistent in how they do things and predictable rather than having some surprises along the way, and being proportionate in how they discharge their statutory functions, and really ensuring that the process doesn't sit heavily on the organisations that interact with it. And that focus goes hand in hand with some jurisdictional changes and other legislative changes that have occurred in recent years. So within the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act, there are, for example, changes to legislation that include safe harbours for certain merger transactions that if you're a small digital startup looking to exit, you might benefit from. I think there is a question about whether or not all of this stuff will actually work, whether or not it will lead to higher growth. I personally am a bit sceptical for a few reasons. The purpose of the CMA, if it's done well, should be to promote growth. That's about driving competition in markets and supporting innovative companies to develop and grow. And through the process of competition in markets to weed out those firms that aren't focused on consumers and don't respond well to that dynamism. I think as well, if you look at the broader landscape, the government is a bit inconsistent in its messaging, because at the same time as it's asking the CMA to go for growth, it's also introducing new digital markets regulation with the CMA as the organisation that will deliver that. And you look across the regulatory landscape, Ofcom, the communications regulator, are doing a lot more in online harms, and in other sectors, the government's introducing regulators. So there is a bit of inconsistency in the landscape in terms of this go for growth message, but also then the extent, the breadth, scale, and extent of regulation in the UK. And when you have these regulatory apparatus, you tend to encourage rent seekers and businesses who don't want to compete on the merits to use regulation as the means by which they grow. And not in all cases, I think, clearly ex-ante regulation can support positive economic outcomes, but you do tend to find where there are sector regulators that companies try and use the regulator to get outcomes that they want rather than compete on the merits. And I expect that we'll see some of that with the digital markets unit. You asked about comparison with other jurisdictions. And one thing to draw out about the digital markets unit and the approach of UK regulators is it tends to be more principle based. So within the legislation that set up the DMU, there's the articulation of the three things that the CMA should promote: fair dealing, open choices, trust and transparency. But the detail of how it does that isn't set out in legislation, and the CMA has to, over a period of time, articulate both through guidance and through its decisions how it will deliver that for firms that it designates with strategic market status. Contrast that to the US, predominantly, if not totally, a judicial system where the government has to litigate to achieve certain outcomes. So a far more judicial process, probably slower, probably fewer cases in the main, and potentially more challenging for the agencies in that system to achieve the outcomes, the policy outcomes they want. And in the EU, similar to the UK, has more ex-ante structures in terms of regulation, but unlike the Anglo approach, which is typically principles-based, the European model tends to prescribe rules, and we've seen that with the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. So setting out up front, here are the things, here are the behaviours or the ways of working that we would like to see, and firms are judged against those rules up front rather than the principles that you see in the UK approach. So it will be interesting to see as these different models play out over time, which tends to support growth more. Although, and to build on a point that Daniel started to make, I think we in the competition community might like to think that what we do is all that matters when it comes to these broader economic questions, but clearly growth and the dynamism of markets rely on a lot more than just competition policy. For example, education policy, tax policy, immigration policy, and so on, all play into whether or not a country has dynamic and growing markets, particularly in the digital space. And I suspect they will end up mattering a bit more than precisely what process the CMA adopts for its regulation in digital markets or beyond.
Thank you very much, Alexander, especially to situate the possible impact that the new rules in the UK might have on the overall agenda of growth, and recognizing that this is just a subset of a larger environment. Thank you for your remarks. Super interesting. And I would like now to turn to Rory O'Donoghue, who's with Google and Global Competition. Rory, what are your views from Google about first of all, if you could summarize to us what you think Google is doing to promote growth and to stimulate growth, and explain to us how you guys are innovating or enabling others to innovate within digital markets. And perhaps we could end with asking you how you think you are addressing the concerns that the CMA may have.
Thank you, Annabelle, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to platform leaders for this opportunity. I'm in a really fortunate position for this question, working at Google, to speak about kind of our role in growth. And I think I would look at kind of, first of all, to the first part of your question, kind of Google's role in encouraging growth in the UK. From our latest figures, Google's products, so Search, Android, and other products generate over £110 billion worth of economic activity in the UK. The Android app economy supports almost 500,000 jobs and nearly £10 billion in annual revenue for British developers. And we have extensive training programs in the UK, encouraging startups, encouraging people to retrain and reskill in the new digital skills, which encourages growth. So I think, Google is a significant contributor to growth. But I also think, when we look at innovation and unlocking productivity growth in the UK, again, that's somewhere where Google is really fortunate. I'm really kind of privileged and still a bit confused as to how I work at a company that has 2 Nobel Prize winners in its Google DeepMind operations, generating AlphaFold, which has got over 2 million users in almost 200 countries, using that for unlocking health developments and advances. But this isn't just about kind of Google's products, and I think Google is, as it was mentioned by Daniel, one of those companies that invests incredibly heavily in research and development. I think our latest figures that Sundar spoke about is that we've invested almost $150 billion in research and development in the last 5 years. We've released publicly over 1,000 pieces of research to make publicly available for researchers and for other developers. It's a story that I like to say is that the T in ChatGPT stands for the transformer, which is referring back to a paper that Google released in 2017. So kind of Google research unlocking a whole swathe of developments that we've seen across the board. And I think, through our investments, through our breakthrough innovations, as well as our kind of supporting of open source research and trainings, I think we are really supporting growth and innovation across the UK. And I think that will be really, really important as we kind of go forward in the AI revolution and seeing the opportunities that AI has for unlocking economic growth, which the government, with its AI strategy, recognised very early on in the term of this government, as previous governments did in the UK as well. I think to the second part of your question, Annabelle, which was about kind of regulatory approaches and the CMA's concerns, I think the first piece to recognise is that we are obviously currently engaging with the CMA as part of a number of investigations under the new Digital Markets Act. So I'm not going to comment specifically on kind of those investigations, although we have talked publicly about kind of our constructive engagement with the CMA. But I think to both Daniel's point and to Alex's points, when we look at economic growth and when we look at competition regulation specifically, I think it's important to recognize the trade-offs that come from any regulations. We at Google have seen in other jurisdictions that kind of onerous prescriptive regimes can have negative consequences for users and for innovation. Alex mentioned the kind of Mario Draghi report about how regulation in the EU, not just competition regulation, but kind of the collective weight of regulations can slow that innovation in Europe. And I think it's really, really important that when we think about these new processes and new regimes, that we think about the user benefit, the growth benefit, and the innovation impacts that this can have. But when we speak about kind of AI innovation that we're seeing a lot of at the moment in digital markets, I think there's 2 points that I think we should note for this ecosystem. The first is the competitive landscape that we're seeing at the moment. AI is now creating competition at every level of the AI stack, from the funding layer to chip design and manufacture, to the compute infrastructure, to the talent, model sizes, deployment, use cases. There is vast amounts of competition across the AI stack. The venture capitalist Mary Meeker said that this is unprecedented in her time following tech developments over 30 years. I think she used that word 51 times in her report recently in viewing the kind of digital landscape. So we can see this competition is robust with many choices. And so when regulators are analyzing this, I think that needs to be seen, that the dynamic nature of the market is 2022 looks very, very different to 2025. And I'm sure 2026 will look very, very different to this time. We simply don't know where the next innovation and breakthrough is going to come from. And I think when we talk about regulatory approaches, kind of recognizing this uncertainty, that we think policymakers should, of course, look at the best ways to regulate. We think that AI is too important not to regulate, but too important not to regulate correctly, and that policymakers should be looking more at a risk-based approach, looking at the outputs of this and taking it as a sector-by-sector basis, and also looking not just at regulation, but also how can AI growth be encouraged through supporting infrastructure, through supporting research and development, skills and retraining, and adoption and implementation by business. That will be important to unlocking the types of growth that the UK government wants. And I'm very proud that Google plays a constructive role across all of these conversations with the UK government, as well as with businesses and other stakeholders.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And thank you for summarizing the role that Google is playing in investing a lot in R&D and stimulating growth. We still have a few minutes, and so I wanted to open up the discussion. So for those of you who want to put their questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. But I wanted to bring your insights together, and I had a question for the panel, and please feel free, any one of you, to comment on it. We've heard from Daniel in the beginning of the session that there's something unique, there's something specific about those digital markets. And we all understand that, under some circumstances, that monopolization can become an outcome that happens naturally. We understand that scale and along with network effects can create self-fulfilling trajectories of growth for a company. And we understand at the same time that those companies who have reached these positions of being very large, very central platforms to ecosystems, they do a lot of innovation. On the other hand, traditional economic theory tends to envision a market renewing themselves by new entrants coming in and disrupting the existing equilibrium of incumbents, that is, dethroning previous incumbents. And I wonder what the panel's views are as to whether they think this is still possible in the digital markets when the advantages of incumbency are so large that allow central big tech platforms in particular to acquire, to make systematic acquisition of potential new entrants on the one hand, and on the other hand, to choose business models where we were just hearing about AI, they could choose to subsidize those AI features to most users, rendering very difficult for other companies to actually make profits and capture value out of selling those services if they are bundled in a free way by existing incumbents. So I'd love to hear your views as to how, in summary, the specificities of the digital markets and structured along platforms and ecosystems might create challenges for growth, in particular in terms of allowing entry and growth of new players.
Annabelle, I'm happy to have a go to start, and I might focus on a particular type of platform, which is those that are advertising funded. I've long held the view that regulators get it wrong when it comes to advertising funded platforms. I think there's a lot of focus on the product side and whether or not there are platforms that exist that do similar functional things for consumers, and they spend a bit less time looking at the advertising side. But if you look at advertising funded platforms and the flow of funds, what are advertisers interested in? Well, online, it's typically purchasing intent and getting their advert in front of people who are likely to act on it. And they're probably more agnostic as to whether or not that advert is served on a particular type of platform that does a certain type of thing or another. But as soon as a better platform comes along for achieving what they're trying to achieve, that money will flow in a different direction. So the competition for that spend plays out at a slightly different level than that which most regulators focus on, which is not firms that look exactly alike on the product side competing with each other, but actually firms that offer advertisers better versions of what they're trying to achieve competing. And I think if some of the new AI models develop in a way where they offer something compelling to advertisers, and we're seeing early product launches that are more in the subscription based arena, then it's quite conceivable that some of the large platforms that have existed for a large part of the last 10 to 20 years and relied on advertising money start to see that money move away into these new products and services. So is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? Is the regulatory focus on the right thing? And I raised that as a specific example of where regulators might be misdirecting themselves as to the competition that ultimately matters, and it may not be between firms that look the same, but actually platforms and other organizations that are innovating and developing the next technological leap. I'm simplifying a lot there. There's a lot more nuance. I've no doubt that people would object to the general view, but I offer that as an example.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you. Rory or Daniel, would you like to comment on?
I'm happy to add something. I mean,
yes.
I think clearly, I mean, there have been winner-takes-all argument. There's a winner-takes-all dynamics here in these sectors, and that's something that has been very hard to escape. As Alex has just said, there is a paradigm shift going on at the moment, which is fascinating to see, probably pretty stressful for people like Rory to be living alongside. But that's the nature of competition. And just going back to your opening remarks, sort of just the question you're asking, I mean, you're right. I mean, if we look way back in time, we sort of Google replaced Yahoo. Some of us could even remember Ask Jeeves and things like that, right? But those sorts of things haven't happened for years and years and years, and that's what made people think about, well, where is something really harmful going on for competition? But equally, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that shares are changing and that new entrants are taking over for a market to be contestable. Because it just needs to be the potential for that to happen, and that it's incentivizing incumbents, and incumbents are acting in a competitive way by maintaining, if they're in that position, put it this way, they have a balance of options. They can either innovate and make sure they stay really strong and good so they're not replaced, or they can, these are not exclusive, but they can also do what they can to curb legitimate competition, i.e. others offering good, useful services that might even be better. And that is the challenge, in a really, really crudely put, that needs to be struck. Now, the reason that the EU and the UK decided we needed to go towards an ex-ante regime, i.e. setting rules up front, was because when you've got that, if those are the sorts of issues you're challenged by, you can't rely on standard ex-post competition law. So standard competition law basically says, broadly, markets work well. There might be a glitch every now and again. There might be a cartel. There might be an abusive behavior by a dominant firm. But if you stop that happening, if you break that legal arrangement, or if you address that abusive dominance, the market goes back to, it self-corrects. It goes back to a competitive dynamic. That's not the case when it comes to monopolies, right? Traditional monopolies. So that's why we've got ex-ante regulation when it comes to network monopolies, because you end up in a whack-a-mole regime, and that's where we were with the platforms. If you're enforcing against the platforms, you say, look, there's a problem going on here. We'll use ex-post competition law, so we'll get this platform for its abusive dominant behavior, but you're not addressing the problem at core or opening up competition. You're just potentially moving it on to another area. So that's why an ex-ante regime is, or I liked how Alex compared the DMA and the DMU, because the benefits of the DMA are predictability. Ironically, one of the CMA's 4 Ps, but the challenges of it are that it can over-intervene by putting a one-size-fits-all rules prescribed basis. But equally, going back to my earlier points, if the CMA is going to deliver on that and rely on its proportionality P in doing that, it needs really to sort of think, well, let's not just take a crude approach, mimic the DMA, or do just a simplistic approach. Let's actually understand what's going on with this particular platform, where the problem lies, and how we preserve its innovation incentives and its willingness to and its ability to innovate, alongside encouraging entry where that is healthy, and when that could be a very legitimate challenge, and lead to that old dynamic that we used to see.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daniel. Rory, would you like to add to that? And I think then we will conclude the session.
No, I think I agree with a lot of points that have been made. I would just say the shift that we're seeing in the ecosystem at the moment is very significant. I did a quick search just before this panel, and the news that's been announced is that OpenAI have already announced a 50% growth in the number of business users that they have to their subscription platform. The Perplexity is now valued at $14 billion already. And there are a rumored distribution deal with Samsung that some papers are reporting on. Those are the types of new entrants that we're seeing in the market, growing at an unprecedented rate. I think OpenAI got to 1 billion kind of users quicker than any other piece of technology ever. There's you can see the charts on this. So I think the nature of competition across the AI stack is enormous. But I also think the changing way that people are interacting with these new services means that the way that we view disruption, or the way we view market entry, is very different now. And I think that is only going to change as this develops even further. So I would say that competition in this space is robust as it's ever been. And I appreciate Daniel noting that Google are also responding in kind of innovating to match this changing consumer behavior.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so I think we will conclude this panel now, and I will say over to you, Leclerc.
Thank you very much, Annabelle, and thank you, Rory, Alexander, and Daniel, for this really interesting panel.